So welcome back to the next video in this series. So if you remember, in the last video we deployed a production ready AWS EKS Kubernetes cluster. So 3 worker nodes which we're going to put the SDN controllers on, and then an EKS master sitting within AWS. So in this video we're going to replace the default AWS CNI with Contrails SDN. So I'm still sat in the directory below my quick start git as with the previous video, and I'm going to look at a small script that I'll give you at the end of the video called deployme.shell. So this doesn't do much other than set up a few environment variables. We'll run through them now, build a config file for you, and then give you the commands to deploy it. It really doesn't take more than a few minutes to deploy the controller. So let's take a look. I've also at the top put some AWS CLI commands that will help you get the parameters in order to complete the fields below. So for example, this one will give you the private IPs of the 3 minions that you deployed in the last video. This one will give you the public IP for accessing the Bastion host. And this one will give you the endpoint of your EKS master. So let's take a look at the script and let's see what you have to fill in. I've pre-filled it just to speed up the video and deployment. So this is the API endpoint for your EKS cluster. Here are the 3 private IPs for the 3 worker nodes that you deployed in the last video. Here's the public IP for accessing your Bastion host. This is where I keep the SSH key for accessing these EC2 instances. If you remember, we specified that key in the stack as we deployed the EKS master in the last video. You'll then need your Juniper GitHub login and password in order to access the code. Here I've hashed them out, X's and Y's. The release, so I'm currently deploying on the November release of Contrail. You can easily change this to a later tag. This is the port that we're going to use to access the Kubernetes master in AWS. And for AWS, it's always going to be 443. We then copy over a template to a new file, contrail EKS-out.yaml. We then search and replace these variables into the file and then give you the commands to deploy. So let's run it. Okay, so we're done. So let's take a look at the file and see what it just built. So this is our YAML deployer. This does an HA cluster of Contrail SDN. It does it as pods on top of Kubernetes, and it also sets up services ready to configure the worker nodes with vRouters. And you can see that the variables we set in the file got passed into environments and then got moved into this file. So we're basically ready to go. And then just to help you, we've got a few commands that you need to run before you deploy. So the first one is going to delete AWS's CNI from the cluster. The next one is going to label the first 3 worker nodes that we built in the last video as masters. They're not strictly Kubernetes masters, but we want in a production environment to reserve them as the SDN controllers. So this is one way to do that. In your lab environment, you could of course set it up so that regular pods are allowed to run on these masters as well. We're then going to create a secret using our Juniper login and password. This secret is going to get passed out to all the nodes. This is so that they can register on the Docker registry and get the Contrail software in order to deploy the pods. And this secret, of course, doesn't have my working login and password. And then we're ready to deploy. And the command to deploy is right here. Okay, so let's apply the YAML that we just configured. And this will create the config maps and the daemon sets in order to deploy the SDN controller cluster across 3 AZs, and also to configure the worker nodes. So you can see it just takes a few minutes to bring the cluster up. So at this point, let's connect to the UI just to take a look. There's actually no need to go into the UI, but just for the sake of the video. So I'm going to use X forwarding through the Bastion in order to reach the GUI. You could, of course, expose the GUI directly with an elastic IP or a load balancer or 1,000 of other ways. This is a cheap and dirty trick just to get quick access. I'll put the commands I used for this in a link at the end of the video. But ultimately, what those commands do is they let me point my local port 8143 through the Bastion host and onto the first controller. You can point to any controller and you'll find the GUI. And what that in turn lets me do is point my browser to localhost 8143 and actually get access to the Contrail UI just so we can take a look. There's no reason to be in here. Admin, Contrail 123 is the default. Now what we're going to see on the dashboard is exactly what we've deployed, right? 3 controllers, 3 analytics nodes, 3 config nodes, a database cluster. There's actually a database for config and a database for analytics. And currently no virtual routers, so no worker nodes, and that's what we're going to go on to do next. Okay, so adding more worker nodes is ridiculously straightforward, and that's one of the reasons we're using the AWS Quick Start. If I just click on the master CloudFormation stack, update the stack, use current template, these are the same parameters that we configured at the start. And I'm just going to go down to my number of nodes and I'm going to say 5 nodes, and then next, and next. And again, don't forget to acknowledge that it's allowed to edit the IAM policy, and update stack. So it's going to take a few minutes to update the stack, and once it's done, we'll have 2 new worker nodes that we can then deploy vRouters on. What you're going to see is it's just a couple of commands to do that. Okay, so it took about 5 minutes to deploy the additional worker nodes. You can see our update has completed. All the stacks say create complete. If we go look at our EC2 instances, we're going to see that we've got 2 new instances. So we had 3 worker nodes and these are running as the SDN controller cluster, and we've just added 2. So looking at Kubernetes, if you remember, we tagged the controllers as master nodes, and we've got 2 nodes saying that they're not ready. And the reason they're not ready, quite simply, is we haven't deployed the CNI on them. So how do we do that? Well, it's incredibly fast and simple. So all we do is we tag the node with a node role. Node role, opencontrail.org, and in this case we're saying run the Ubuntu agent, because remember, we've switched EKS to deploy Ubuntu workers. If we don't specify the dash Ubuntu at the end, then it will deploy for CentOS, or if we change to the RHEL GitHub repository, it will deploy on RHEL. That's the first node done. Now the second. And you could, of course, pre-tag these nodes. I just wanted to show you how it works. Now in a few minutes, those nodes are going to show ready. And once they're ready, that will mean that the vRouter has been deployed on them, has been integrated into Kubernetes, and these are ready to go. These are ready for your pods and applications to be deployed. So if you really step back and think about it, all we really did to deploy the Contrail SDN cluster was to take one YAML file, run it, wait a few minutes for the controller to come up, and then to tag the computes. And there you go, the nodes are ready. Okay, so as you can see, we're back on the GUI. We were still connected, our controller cluster is still running, but we've now got the addition of 2 vRouter nodes. And if we take a look, the vRouters have been up a couple of minutes now, and they're starting to gather analytics, which is what we'd expect. If we look at the configuration, here are our vRouters. They're automatically configured by Contrail as they come up. So that's it. The next thing to do would be to deploy your applications, and what will happen is they will get deployed in the overlay SDN, as we've shown in the other videos in this YouTube site.